Aloha. Good evening. I'm Lynette Cruz. I am an assistant professor of anthropology at Hawaii Pacific University, and I welcome you to Ho'oulu Lahui Aloha. This is a program that's sponsored by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and it covers generally all kinds of interesting topics for people in Hawaii and abroad. And tonight, lucky for us, we have three interesting and distinguished guests, and we're here to talk about Malama Makua, defending Makua Valley. Let me introduce you Sparky Rodriguez from Malama Makua, and also Dr. Fred Dodge from Malama Makua, and sitting on Dr. Dodge's right is David Henkin from Earth Justice. Welcome to you all. I want to start, first of all, by asking you all to introduce yourselves, because my introduction is so perfunctory. Let's start with Sparky.
Well, I'm a resident of Waianae and grew up out there when my grandmother lived at Makaha. And in relation to Makua, sometimes in the middle of the night there'd be huge explosions that would rock the house and rattle the windows. And I still live in Waianae, Lu'ulule. But I'd like to share a little bit about Waianae, the coast, as part of my introduction, because that's where I'm from. Kalailua, Barbers Point, is sort of the entry point leading into Waianae, heavy industrial. The next part there is Waimanalo Gulch. And Waimanalo Gulch takes in all the solid waste of Oahu. After that is Kahe Power Plant. And up until recently, they were using high sulfur fuels to power their generators. After that is Nanakuli, and in that Ahupua is the highest population of Hawaiians in the state, maybe in the world. After that, you have an industrial construction dump that hundreds of trucks go there almost every day to unload their construction waste. And after that, we've got Lu'ulule, the naval magazine for weapon storage, and 2 million-watt towers that transmit communication signals. And when they do a burst transmission, my alarm on the car goes off. The speakers on my TV that's off rattles and makes noise. And then on top of Ka'ala and the ridges of Kaena is the antenna for radar. And then we get to Makua. And before that, we also downwinders from Schofield. So all the training, all the chemical weapons that was used there, the DU weapons, the conventional weapons. If they do a burn, all of that ash comes down and rains on our community. And at Makua, they've been using that valley, the Army has, or the military has, since the late 20s. So we're already past 80 years of use. And our community has been basically brought into a war theater and maybe collateral as part of the war efforts that the U.S. has been engaged in around the world. But we've been at every war with the training and the exposure to all of the contaminations that go along with training and military activity. And I never started off as an activist, but as the constant exposure and these types of elements became evident in my community, I started getting more involved in my family as well.
I think this is actually an introduction that's excellent for people who do not live on Oahu and who do not live in Hawaii, because just talking about Makua Valley is not something that people can envision, but I think your description is really good about the whole leeward coast of this island of Oahu, and not that much detail, but enough for people to imagine what it's really like to be there. Fred, introduce yourself.
Well, hello. Cool. Yes, I'm a retired physician at this point, having worked at the Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center for over 30 years and been a part of Malama Makua for the last 18 years. I guess I would start out by some history in that when the military took over Makua Valley, and Sparky's right, they've had a presence since the late 20s, but they took over Makua Valley 1942-43. And when they did so, they signed an agreement with the territory, and that agreement said that they would be returning Makua Valley in the condition that would be satisfactory to the territorial government, which was the government at the time, and that it would occur, this returning would occur 6 months after the end of World War II, which would have been in 1946. Well, over 65 years later, it's not been returned, and we would like the military to keep its promises. And the other thing they say, the military says, it's been a good neighbor, and good neighbors clean up their messes. We would like them to clean up the mess and return the valley. Mahalo.
Thank you, and I'd like to get back to the whole idea of the formation of Malama Makua in a little while, but let's hear from David.
Aloha. My name is David Henkin. I'm an attorney with Earth Justice, which is a public interest environmental law firm. I work in the Mid-Pacific office, which has been going strong here in Hawaii since 1988. I joined the office in 1995 and currently serve as a staff attorney. And one of my first assignments when I got into the office was to come out to the Waianae Coast and meet with a few residents who were very concerned about live fire training at Makua and its effect on the environment. And when I say the environment, I mean very broadly writ, including not only the water, the air, the plants, but also the cultural sites and the people of the community. There were grave concerns. There are very few places in the United States where live fire training is done in such close proximity to highly populated areas. And as Sparky has already mentioned, these are areas predominantly Pacific Islander, high concentration of Native Hawaiians. So we had some real concerns about the effects of the training on the community. And for years, the community had been asking the Army, which runs Makua Military Reservation, to prepare an environmental review document to look at what those impacts might be, again, on everything from community health to endangered species to cultural sites. And for years, the Army had refused. So I got involved as an Earth Justice lawyer back in 1995. We filed the first lawsuit against the Army challenging their failure to do environmental review in 1998. Pardon me. And here we are in 2010. It's been about nearly going on 12 years in court, and we've had a lot of successes along the way to force that environmental review, to force changes to the training, to open up the valley to cultural access, and to start reestablishing the cultural connection between the people of the Waianae Coast community and highly sacred sites. But we have a lot of work left to do, and hopefully we'll be talking about that today.
Yes, and I'm going to make the assumption that, well, it should be safe to assume that Malama Makua, the organization, came about because of what you're talking about, the expectation that certain kinds of things are going to be done and they weren't done. So people would need to actually know what Malama Makua is. What is it about? What is it that you do?
Well, you know, initially when I first went, and before Earth Justice, it was Sierra Legal Defense.
Legal Defense Fund.
And they said that their efforts are mostly around environment or the endangered species. And at that point, we were looking for help from the community. And I realized that the Native Hawaiian endangered species had no voice in the discussion. And that was our starting point. But as we went along, the question also came up, all the contamination in the ordnance, the chemicals that are being used in training was being left behind, unexploded ordnance. And one of the examples, dinitrotoluene, DNT, changes us genetically. And I found from the UXO guys that dispose of the weapons, they said not all of the chemicals are exploded. So some of it's thrown out back into the environment. And those that don't explode, as the casings rust and corrode, everything becomes exposed. In fact, the first lead bullet that was shot in the late 20s, is still there, corroding and becoming part of the environment that we're now exposed to. And all along the Army said, no, everything stays within the range and doesn't come outside. And we found through the studies, and the EIS has helped, the work the Army has done, has helped us understand the level of contamination and how it's expanded. And part of that awareness is also we found that they were dumping out in the ocean. So adding those conditions to our community, we're under extreme pressure environmentally, and it's affecting our health. And I think Fred will attest that in our community there's higher levels of skin issues, respiratory issues, and all the other things, cancers, health issues out in the Waianae Coast. And part of that, I believe, is influenced by the impact of the training that has affected our community, our health, and all the endangered species that are at risk of extinction.
Fred, can you speak to the issue of health, not just of the people but of the land as well?
Yes. There's no question that we have a high incidence of the conditions that Sparky mentioned, plus a lot of diabetes, hypertension, cancer. And although it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact causes of these conditions, I think that the amount of contamination in the coast, and I'm going to add one more to your list, and that is the ordnance reef, the dumping of munitions as well as poisonous gases off the coast of Waianae. It's got to all be tied together.
We asked a question also of David, and then kind of hopefully you'll also be having a discussion with each other, as you just did when Sparky missed something.
Yeah, well, one of the main things that Earth Justice has been focusing on over these 12 years has been trying to get good information to the community about what the effect of military training at Makua has been. As previously mentioned, that training started in the 1920s, but then following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the entire western tip of Oahu was taken over for training, including Makua. At the time, there were families living in the valley. They were evicted, their land seized, and as Fred mentioned, a promise that the lands would be returned 6 months after the end of the war. That did not happen, and there has been over the years, there has been incredibly intense military training at Makua. People who are watching the show right now, because of the litigation, there has been no live fire training at Makua since 2004, and there's been almost no live fire training at Makua since 1998. So the way that the public often thinks about issues, they maybe think about this training as being a thing of the past. But during the period of time from World War II until 1998, you had incredibly intense military training that not only was land-based, but you would have ships offshore shooting shells into the valley. You would have bombs of up to 1,000-pound bombs being dropped on the valley. You had helicopters with rockets. So this incredible assault on this land and on its cultural sites. And the people of the area, very understandably, wanted to know, what's the effect of all that? And the Army had always said, oh, don't worry about it. There's not much there, and there's not much that can be damaged. So it's hard to believe, but when we started this effort in 1995, at that time, there were very few cultural sites that were known from Makua. And so Malama Makua and the other folks in the community, they knew the mo'olelo, they knew the stories, and they knew that this was an area that had great cultural significance. Makua means parents. And so, but the Army archaeologists who had controlled the valley, and the Army had controlled the valley since World War II, their surveys showed that there were a couple of sites, I think they had maybe 17 that were listed. We knew that there had to be more. And so we also knew that when the Army was saying, don't worry about the munitions that have been dropped on the valley, don't worry about, there was an open burn and open detonation area in the valley. They had an area where literally they would bring in ordnance, they'd bring in medical waste, they'd bring in all of these things that they just wanted to get rid of, and they'd burn it in open pits. And they said, no, don't worry about it. There couldn't possibly be any chemical contamination getting out of the valley, running into the nearshore areas where people fish and gather limu to put on their family's table, where kids play. And so when Malama Makua came to us, what they wanted more than anything else was just information. And fortunately, there's a law, the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires federal agencies to give the public honest information about what the impacts of their activities are. And the Army was just flouting that law and refusing to do it. So our efforts have been primarily to get that information out on the table, because the philosophy of the law and our philosophy is that once the public has all that information, and not only about the impacts of training at Makua, but also questioning, why are they training at Makua? Why would you take a sacred valley? Why would you take an area full of endangered species? Why would you take an area so close to these communities and train? And learned about alternatives, that out of that would flow better choices, that the public would make better choices. So, I won't go into all the details, but from 17 cultural sites that were known in the mid-90s when we started, the Army, under pressure from Malama Makua and Earth Justice, through our settlement agreements, through the litigation, has had to do archaeological surveys. Now we have cultural sites that number more than 100. Back in the 90s, we knew that there were many federally listed endangered and threatened species, plants and animals in the area. Now that number has grown from what we previously knew. Now we know that there's at least 41 endangered species, threatened species, some of which exist at Makua and nowhere else. We now know through the studies that we forced the Army to do that contaminants are flowing out of that valley, and that with every rainfall event that starts the streams running, you have all sorts of military-related and industrial pollutants going into an otherwise pristine nearshore area where people fish, where people play. We have a lot more information, and that's been a big focus of our efforts.
I can imagine people watching this program and shaking their heads. And yes, information is really good,
Yeah.
but what do you want?
Well, I just want to share a little bit. David was talking about the cultural sites. And some of the initial walkthroughs that we were able to do, all of the Makai, ocean-facing faces of the cultural sites, the walls, whether Kuleana walls or ranch walls, all were bullet hole lidding. There's a huge pohaku with Aiha'a, and it's one of the older petroglyphs that's in the valley, and there's bullet holes in it. So all the training, they were not visibly aware of. To them, it was a pile of rocks, and they didn't stop long enough to see or even try to understand the cultural significance, even though the people of Waianae were telling them for decades that it was significant. This was a heiau, this was a house site, this is a burial. And during the ranch time, they would bury the horses along with the cowboy. And so some of those areas, they're all historic, but they were also within the training corridor. And the bombs, the bullets, the training activity was all going on in that area. And a lot of it was not evident until the EIS started pointing these things out as they were forced to start to examine what was really there.
Can I ask what the relationship is right now between Malama Makua and the military? I mean, it's aside from the fact that the attorneys are working on making them do stuff. Is there a relationship?
My
opinion is strained, but Fred might
Definitely.
have.
I don't think they're very happy. I mean, they want to train, and they haven't done so in over 5.5 years. And as David has said, the environmental impact statement, the EIS, which is so crucial, they published it as a final EIS last June, and I think the record of decision came out in July or August. And that means that, once they said once they get the record of decision, they can train. Well, we looked at that, and David can mention more, and the marine study is really deficient, as well as the subsurface archaeological studies. For instance, on the marine study, they were supposed to test the limu, the seaweed, which all of us here eat. And first of all, they weren't sure of what they got. I think it turned out that it wasn't one of the common or edible limu, and they found high amounts of arsenic in that particular limu. And common sense would be that you would test it further, because if it's in the inorganic state, it's poisonous, very poisonous. You know the play arsenic and old lace and so on. But if it's in the organic state, it's not poisonous. But they didn't do that. It's a major deficiency. First of all, they should get the best type of limu, and if they had come to the community, people like William Ayla and other fishermen, they would have known what limu to actually test. But that's just an example. You may want to add more.
Yeah, well, they admitted that they sent people into the field to do this marine resources study. One of the conditions of a settlement agreement that we entered into in 2001, and then there was a follow-up agreement in 2007, was that the Army, now that we had demonstrated through studies of the stream water flowing out of Makua that there were at least 40 different types of contaminants coming off of the land at Makua and going into the ocean. And you need to remember that since the Army is the only person who's been operating there since 1942, that if you're getting modern chemical contaminants, it's from the Army. It's from the activities that they've conducted. So once we had proved that, we got an agreement that said they would actually test the fish, they test the limu, they test the shellfish, they test the other types of marine organisms that people rely on for subsistence, to put food on their family's table. And then they would test them to figure out whether or not people should be concerned about eating them, whether the military training in the past had caused contamination, whether the training that they proposed for the future would cause contamination. And they actually sent people into the field to do the research that didn't know what types of limu people eat and they don't eat. And so they admit in the study, none of the limu that we gathered, well, first of all, they didn't know what it was. They couldn't identify what it was. So if they asked any cultural practitioner, anyone at all, who gathers limu, they could have gone out and said, pick here, don't pick there. But instead of using the community, they said, oh, we'll do it. They sent people completely ignorant of the local conditions. They gathered stuff that they couldn't identify, not only to species, but in some cases to genus. They just had no clue what it was, but they did concede none of it was edible, something would eat. Then they tested it. Then they came up with these readings off the charts for arsenic. I mean, just crazy off the charts. Not only did they not, as Fred said, test it to determine if it was poisonous, inorganic, or relatively benign organic arsenic, but they didn't bother to go anywhere else in the state that would not be subject to military training to see what the levels of arsenic are in that type of limu. Instead, in their study, they compared the levels of arsenic in limu in Hawaii with seaweed gathered in Antarctica. Totally different species, totally different conditions. I mean, they might as well have collected it from the moon. So the reason that we're currently back in court with the Army, we're challenging the adequacy of these studies that are so important to the people of the Waianae Coast, and whether the Army recognized the importance of it to the community to which it owes, some consideration. It entered into an agreement. The court entered that as an order. It is legally bound to do that, and we're determined to make sure that we get that information.
I had asked earlier about the organization, Malama Makua, and the reason I asked is because I'm actually quite familiar with it. Hawaii Pacific University sends students out every semester to Makua Valley to learn the history about the valley, and whenever possible to do some cleanup on the road or outside or wherever. And I thought maybe you would talk a little bit about how you malama Makua.
Well, I'd like to start. I'm a Vietnam vet, and not all veterans are pro-war. I would like to see an outcome of peace out of all of these things, and peace for Makua, peace for the Waianae community. And having guests come in on the cultural access to actually see what the valley's like and feel what it's like and be inside the gate and have the different perspectives. The Army's there with all of their tour guides, I guess, to sort of keep us in line and not allow us to go beyond certain barriers that they've set. Initially, years ago, we were able to go just about anywhere in the valley. Some of the photos we have with flak jacket and helmets on to go to where some of the unexploded ordnance was visible. Since then, they've really confined our access to a very limited number of sites. But what happens when you go there and you listen to the stories, you see the petroglyphs, and you sort of imagine what it was like hundreds of years ago. And way back when, an adjoining Ahopua, Ohikilolo, was the center of government for Oahu at that point, 800 years ago. And Makua is where they lived, the ali'i, or the families lived. And it was a very hard place to get to. And adjoining the sister valley was Kauai Hapai, which is on the Wailua side, over the Waianae Range. So it was an isolated valley. And if you get there and you can start imagining what it was like. And right now, because of all the previous training and the burns, all the native forests, not all, there's some strands that are still surviving on the lower levels, are gone. It's all alien grasses, alien plants. And imagine what it would be like to return it to those conditions. And that's kind of the future vision that we've discussed in the community. But inviting the University of Hawaii students, we've had elementary students come in HPU as well, and they get a different perspective of what the valley could possibly be used for other than live fire training.
Or maybe was used for, because if you tell me that it used to be a center of government, the implication is that there was a lot of water there. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, some of the elders said the streams flowed. And the movie Hawaii, James Michener's movie Hawaii, it was shot right in front of one of the stream areas that is flowing. And the trees, as you look back in the valley in that movie, some of them are, it looks like 30, 60 feet tall. Huge forested area.
So different from what people imagine Waianae Coast to look like today,
Yes.
which is like all dry and no place to plant anything.
Yes.
Fred?
Well, yeah, we would, to add to what Sparky says, we would like to, our vision, part of our vision is to reforest Makua. And I think if we get it and we can reforest it, which we would do, the streams would then not be so intermittent. They would flow much more often. Yeah.
Why are they intermittent now?
Well, there's been a lot of fires there. Almost all are military started. I have plenty of photos of the fires that have been started there. So you don't see the forest that you'd see as late as the late 60s when the movie Hawaii was shot there. And you can see how nice and green it was. But one of the things we got out of this agreement with the Army in 2001 is that we can take people into the valley, what we call cultural accesses, twice a month, plus makahiki twice a year. That's overnight twice a year. And one is coming up on the 20th of February. I don't know if this will get out in time, but if it does, you need to have your name on a list and given to the Army 2 days in advance. So by the 18th, we'd need to, or maybe the 17th, we'd need to know if anybody wants to come to the last day of the makahiki. But I have an example of the access. This is a rather famous access that occurred in May. In May of 2002, with Uncle Walter Kamana, who is second from the left, and from the right as you're looking at it. Sorry, for me it's the left, but for you it's right. And the mascot Missy, that's there. But we take people in to the valley twice a month. They need, again, we need to supply names to the military. It's part of the agreement. So you need to call at least 4 days prior to the access, but twice a month. And
I see that the military are included in the picture, which tells me something really kind of interesting about what it means to malama or to care for.
This is right. This is a kind of famous thing. We still do it sometimes, but they don't fraternize as much as they did then. So this is.
Could I ask what the structure is? That
yes, the
stone
structure is an ahu, or since it's standing upright, some people call it a ku ahu. And what one of our cultural activities is to leave ho'okupu on the altar here. For some people, it's a religious significance. For everybody, it's cultural, certainly. And it's like, when you go to visit your favorite auntie or grandma, you often bring a pie or a bottle of wine or something, and we want to leave our respects to the valley and ask for protection and so on.
I do recall one time being up there and somebody left a can of orange soda. And I thought it was kind of neat because that's what he had.
Yes, that's what he had.
So it was, for him, a really good thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I know that I'm trying to imagine other photos that I've seen in the past, because when I was there last with my students, I saw taro growing in the valley in a spring.
Yes, and we have pictures. Sparky is getting that one out, and there is the famous taro, which I was originally started because it was left as a ho'okupu, on one of the early makahikis, early 2000 decade, and then we don't leave the ho'okupu on the ahus. It would rot, it would attract whatevers, and there's sometimes stray dogs and so on. So we take the ho'okupu, the offerings out, and this was a kalo that then was offered to the spring. And this is a well-known spring. And anyway, it liked it. And I remember later on, one of the army members accused us of cultivating kalo. So now we're taroists.
That's not necessarily bad.
No, not at all. We thought it was a compliment. But yes, this is our vision of the University of Makua, which would include environmental stewardship. We would like it to be a center of excellence for UXO removal, where we could test new technologies, export that. We would offer jobs to the people of Waianae, which has already happened once for UXO clearance, and in fact this was taken during that time by my son Vince. And those pictures, that's the pictures on the left. Yes, we have other visions for Makua as a cultural center, as a protection for the cultural sites, and I believe, David, the last count of sites was 120, which is a lot more than there used to be. And each site has, sometimes there are dozens of features, parts of the site. So there's over 1,000 features. It's an archaeological district. It's an archaeological cultural gold mine, Makua. And as such, along with the endangered species, it's just an inappropriate place to train. And it would just be common sense to not endanger that.
So University of Makua actually sounds like a really good idea, because all the information that you need to find out about it is there already.
Yes.
Just for the people who are watching and don't understand what UXO means, could you explain?
Certainly. Unexploded ordnance. I know that Sparky had mentioned that. And because of all the things that were dropped, the ordnance, you know, that in the World War II era when a great deal was dropped, although there's been a lot dropped since then, the amount of duds, unexploded ordnance that didn't go off, was probably between 10 and 15%. They claim it's less now. But in any case, I have another picture which I can show later of a 1,000-pound bomb that was dropped from a plane that we were allowed to go and inspect. Again, we were wearing flak jacket and helmet and all that. And I noticed as I got closer that there was a date on the bomb. It said 1944. So I asked the explosive ordnance tech that was there, standing beside this bomb, that they, instead of detonating it, they should get a helicopter, lift it up, send it back to the manufacturer, and tell them, you know, refund our government's money.
It didn't work.
No. But again, for the University of Makua Cultural Center, there's a beautiful picture in the center top of a makahiki. And this is taken by a good friend of Makua's and an excellent photographer, Jan Beckett, who teaches at Kamehameha, but I think his great skill as a photographer would probably get him anywhere. And obviously there we have built other ahus on the beach. This is on the right, and there's a picture of Ukanipo Heiau up top there, and another one of those axes over on the right. Sparky, I can't see all this stuff, but a center of education, a cultural education, of passing down knowledge from our kupuna, keeping the culture alive.
Up there on your left, you said Auntie Frenchie?
That is Auntie Frenchie on there, and I want to acknowledge her as a really great friend, a member of our community group, Hui Malama o Makua, with William Isla also is in that picture, I believe. And if I can take this time to mention other kupunas who have helped us a great deal. Ivanhoe Naivi, who was born in Makua and who I got to know in the Ohikilolo struggle. They were going to build a golf course there, and we were able to fight that off. And unfortunately, he was taken from us way too soon. But before he died, he talked to myself. I know he also talked to William Ayla, and said, you know, we saved Ohikilolo. Now we have to go and save Makua. So he's one of my mentors. Another mentor is Charlie Rainey, who was a cowboy in Makua, and I happen to know some of the members of his family. So he was a great help. Jay Landis, who is part of the Silva clan out there, has always felt that Makua ought to be returned. He was a great help, and unfortunately he died. And then Walter Kamana, who you saw in the last picture, who came and mentioned a lot of knowledge about the valley. We really miss him. You know, there's some people that are alive, like Auntie Frenchie is still with us, and Po'onui Lopez, another kupuna, been very, very helpful for us. And there are others, and I'm sorry if I can't remember everybody or didn't mention their names.
Yeah, and the photos that we have up right now shows some of the burns that have burnt to the tops of the mountain. So the endangered species have been under attack.
Including the people?
Including the people. And their environment, their homes have been destroyed by fires. And it's not only one fire. Over the years, there have been hundreds of fires. And each time the fire burns, it burns the environment, the trees, the native trees, the grasses, and the threat to the endangered species has really been enormous.
And it damages the sites. And can you point out, excuse me for interrupting, Sparky, but can you point out in the center towards you where your wife is? Yes, that is the Petroglyph Rock area. Yeah. And Kyle Kajihiro is there, another been a great help from AFSC.
How did that get found? I mean, did it just like appear, or was it always there? What?
Well, Uncle Walter remembers it when he was a child living in Makua, visiting Makua. And it then somehow got lost or disappeared. I don't know what you can say, but it wasn't recognized. And one of the explosive ordnance people, one day they were exploring that area. Actually, there were a pair of them. And the EOD guy, he was leaning against this rock, and he looked over there, and he saw this picture of an ilio, which is one of my favorites there. There was a dog petroglyph, and he called the guy over. And so it was rediscovered in the 90s, I believe, late 90s. But it has suffered damage. It has had weathering, and the fires didn't help that were there.
Yeah. And it was overgrown. But there's also signs of bullet holes on that
yes,
as
there
well.
Are. You're right.
So everything there, and it's the accidental effects of training. But we have one more, and more about the future. Not only the legal part, but also the hope and dreams of what Makua may look like in a generation or 7 generations, because a cleanup this vast is going to take generations. It's not going to happen overnight. And one of the things is hopefully we'll be able to discuss the return of Makua. And so some of the items that we've talked about are some of the history, the battles that we're facing, the stresses that we're facing now, because some of the people in the community don't like what we're doing. Some of them think we're making money off of this, which is totally not true. Although in the cases in court, David has been very, very successful, along with their justice, in winning. The Army doesn't like that. But
I should make clear, Sparky, that when we win for Makua. None of us are getting any money out of that. It's, yes. What we've been able to achieve in the court is a series of court orders requiring the Army to comply with the environmental laws, and that's meant modifying the training to be more protective. That's meant preparing an environmental impact statement to provide the information to the community. And right now, we've managed to accomplish a situation where, as a result of the legal efforts, there was no training at all at Makua from 1998 until 2001. Then there was a brief period from October of 2001 till June of 2004 where the Army was permitted under a settlement agreement to do a limited amount of training. They did about 26 training exercises over the course of those 3 years, so less than 9 per year, as opposed to the hundreds per year that they used to do. And then since June of 2004 till, as we sit here today in February of 2010, there has been no live fire training at Makua. And that's important in 2 ways. One is this rest period for Makua has provided an opportunity under the requirement to do the environmental impact statement for archaeological and biological surveys to happen, investigations that could not happen if the Army was regularly blowing up the valley while training. And that's allowed for the discovery of the over 100 archaeological sites that Fred referenced, and also additional endangered species that we didn't even know were at Makua before. But the other thing is that as far as helping the public to get a better understanding of what the future could be for Makua, is when we started this effort, the Army would just beat on this, there'd be this rhetorical drumbeat. Training at Makua is essential for national security. We have to train there or we can't protect the nation, which, you know, on its face seems a little bit hyperbolic, but people are reluctant to question the military commanders. They must know what they're talking about. Well, think about the time period, 1998 until 2010. This country has been at war for most of that time, multiple wars, with the soldiers based in Hawaii repeatedly deploying abroad to combat. And during almost all of that time, Makua has been closed to live fire training, and yet the military has been able to carry out its mission. So that leads to the question of, well, what next? There is no live fire training at Makua as we sit here today. What is the future going to be? And Fred and Sparky have been talking about what the community's vision for that future is, which is instead of a place of training and war, a place of renewal and life and learning, and that will bring economic value back to the community. And right now, the Army is talking about wanting to resume live fire training at Makua. And so really we're at a fork in the road, and hopefully through the information that we've been able to get through the litigation, people have a better sense that there is a choice, that there are different futures.
So I shouldn't ask this, I guess, because I'm not really sure if it's ready for any kind of action or activity at all, but is there discussion in the community right now in terms of how to meet this need, this goal, to actually transition away from the Army's use of the valley as a training site or for blowing up unexploded ordnance into something that would be really positive and a learning place? I mean, is there like right now efforts to create that, the dream, the strategy, the plan?
There's discussion, and within several groups in Waianae, Malama Makua for sure, Hui Malama Makua as well, and it's around, for Makua's mission, it's get as much information about what's happening at Makua. So the EIS has helped us learn, clean up the valley, and within that, how do we end up learning how to do it, and maybe create an economic engine for our community to work on the cleanup, which is going to take generations. And then how do we incorporate the universities, higher learning, and then maybe export that into other communities that have been exposed to these kinds of contamination. And the other thing is return it to a more cultural and traditional use, restoring the native forests, protecting the endangered species and help them thrive. But also how do we help our community thrive at the same time by making it a safer environment. So in that discussion, there's a lot to be talked about, and we're going to need a lot more help and a lot more discussion to go on. And for right now, though, is how do we get the Army to start cleaning? And how do we get, because I would hate it to be like Ko'olave, where they spend $400 million and they leave. And they say, well, okay, we're done. We're out of money, so we're not going to do anymore. And there's still a whole bunch of mess left. When I visited Vieques in Puerto Rico, same thing. They turned the property over to Fish and Wildlife, put up a fence and say no access. And they let the natives grow, but you can see the bombs still sitting there on the land. and the contamination still leaching into the environment. So I don't want that for Makua. I don't want that for Waianae. And I don't think anyone there in Waianae wants that either. So we want to participate in the process of hopefully the ultimate return of Makua. And I think this is where we as a community need to get in touch with our legislators, our congressional representatives, and even the candidates that are coming up and talk to them about the return of Makua. And not only here it is, or we're going to write you a check, but how do we make it so our community sustains itself while we're taking care of our aina?
If I may add, Sparky, to what you have just said, we have in the past been able to do some plantings of native willy tree there. And we certainly have dug out the spring that Uncle Ivanhoe, there's a famous picture in Marion Kelly's monograph done in 1976 where he's dipping his hands in the water of the spring, and that spring got buried because the South Firebreak Road was expanded. But you know, we've been able to do that. We cleaned out the well, and this is at a time when there was more cooperation with the Army. We also have two cultural events that occur. One is the Makua Sunrise, which is on Easter morning, and it starts at 6 a.m. promptly. The gates open at 5:30. I don't think last year we didn't have to sign up ahead of time, but you may be asked to write your name on a list. But in any case, it's a very ecumenical service on Easter morning, and there's a lot of Hawaiian culture also. We also have a Christmas vigil that was started back in 1994 with Sister Anna McInerney, which some people may know. She was a very active Marinol nun that lived on the Waianae coast, and a group of families, we got together, and we still continue that. And we had a very successful Christmas vigil, and it's usually held on the weekend between Christmas and New Year's. So we are trying, we're making whatever we can do. We're more limited by the military. They're not happy because they haven't been able to train. So they don't want to cooperate as much as they did. But we still go ahead with it. And yes, this is the other vision we have of the University of Makua, and that is a center of excellence for reforestation and fire control and environmental mentoring and malaming the valley. The picture on the that one right there is, you can, I don't know if they can make it out in the video in the camera, but there is a black arc that's part of a circle that was an ancient emu site, and the black is a charcoal ring, and that was tested, carbon dated, and found there were about 13 of them, and they were found to date between 1290 and 1350, which means that your ancestors and Sparky's ancestors were in that valley. If there were that many emus within that time, there must have been quite a group there. You know, yeah. The estimate is. My
wife Leandra says that it's 800 BC, 800 years before Cook.
They were cooking.
they were
but
cooking.
What was interesting about their find is that the wood that they used was a'ali'i, and there is no a'ali'i forest in Makua. There are a few trees that are sprouted up, but what would that environment look like in a'ali'i? And how you would have to have a significant amount of that tree. Now we know it as a shrub, but it must have been a tree for them to have the necessary elements to do an imu of that size. And all of that is within the training corridor.
So what we were doing there at that particular access was actually changing the protective cover, because this is an area where mortars especially go out of bounds. And there have been, well, we found mortar tails all over the place over there. So the Army originally put sandbags over it, but then the sandbags sprouted grasses and so on. The roots went down into this and do more damage. So we volunteered, and at that time we accepted to change that and put a different covering. So
There has been, so what you're seeing is there has been some cooperation between Malama Makua and the military over time. What's the possibility that there may be more cooperation in the future? Because it's, I don't know if it's to their benefit in terms of the goals that they're trying to meet, which are obviously different than Malama Makua's. But what's your thought, David?
Well, the goal, when we entered into the first settlement agreement with the Army, which was in 2001, that's when we reached agreement that they would do the environmental impact statement. That's when we reached agreement that they would allow cultural access into the valley, that they would start removing unexploded ordnance. We reached a very far-reaching set of principles. The idea there, the hope there, was that we would start fostering a relationship of cooperation and trust, recognizing that the Waianae Coast community and the Army have differing visions for the future, but the idea was we'd reach some agreement on some things and let's work cooperatively together. The experience over now almost a decade has been that a lot depends on the individuals who are in the Army command. And one of the unfortunate things from our perspective is that those commanders turn over with great frequency. So every 2 years or so, you get a brand new person in. Maybe they've never been stationed in Hawaii before. They have no understanding of Hawaiian culture. But regardless, they have, they're brand new to this situation. And it's an unusual case where you've got a training area so close to a community. It's an unusual, I think it's a unique situation where you have a set of agreements to allow cultural access and a degree of involvement of the community in the operation of a military facility. These commanders, generally when they walk in the door, most of them are very uncomfortable with that. And they question why the Army ever entered into this deal to begin with. And some of them, and it really just depends on the individual personality. Some of them understand the benefit of collaborating with the community. They have some sensitivity maybe to some of the issues, and others just view it as an obstacle, as an impediment. So we've really seen it go, usually if you get a commander who's open to it, by the end of their 2-year stint, we're working together very cooperatively, very smoothly. We accommodate their reasonable requests, they accommodate our reasonable requests. But then someone new walks in the door and you're back to square one. So it's, unfortunately, it's just not a good setup to build those types of relationships. We do have those types of relationships with some of the staff who are, they're long-termers.
And they live here.
They live here, they understand, they're around. So we have some of those relationships, but ultimately the culture of the military is whoever's got the stars on his shoulders is in charge, and whatever he says goes. And so it's been a challenge.
I understood that that was the reason for rotation, was so that you don't get embedded in a community, that you can actually understand your position relative to the community's position.
One of the things we found in our community is that you'd make an agreement with one general, and the minute he leaves, no agreement. Everything starts
Back to
off.
square one,
And
yeah.
the next general said, well, I didn't say that. I don't have to abide by that.
Which is why we've learned through hard experience that if you want something to stick, it needs to be signed, it needs to be in writing, and preferably it needs to be filed with the court. And which is why, unfortunately, we often find ourselves repeatedly back in court going over the same ground because we have agreements, they're clear, they're in writing, but again, some of the new commanders are not understanding that this is something that constrains them or that obliges them to respond to community needs. I did want to very briefly touch on one question, Lynette, that you'd asked in terms of forward momentum for a different future for Makua. And I think that if you take the long view, when these efforts, when this collaboration between Earth Justice and the Waianae Coast community, while we directly represent Malama Makua, we work with Hui Malama o Makua, we work with all sorts of individuals and organizations on the Waianae Coast. When we started that out, there was a very, very small group of people deeply concerned about Makua's future and saw a different future for the valley. But I think it's fair to say that many, many people in the community were either strongly wedded to the Army's got to stay there, or indifferent. You know, the apathy that comes with feeling like you can't make a change. And because of the years of outreach and education, supplemented by shows like this and cultural access and just a lot of information sharing, layered on top of that with the information we've been able to get from the EIS process, layered on top of that with just a variety of opportunities like the lack of training for 5 years and more to demonstrate that there is not a need for that training for the Army to do its job. We've started to win over more and more people to the notion that we look at this sacred place, we look at this special place, and is bombing it the highest and best use for this community? And I think more and more people are coming around, and you see that not only within the community, but within the news media, which very often it's easy for them to take a sort of pro-Army stance because it's a simple message to deliver. But more and more we're seeing editorial positions questioning the Army's claims about needing to train at Makua and recognizing the reasonable demands of the community that over 60 years after the end of World War II, it's finally time to give the land back.
And I know there's an article in Honolulu Weekly about Makua, so that's really good. We're about running out of time. I wanted to thank you, Sparky, and also Fred and David for all this wonderful information. In the last few seconds that we have, let me say mahalo to Office of Foreign Affairs for allowing us to share this information on Ho'oulu Lahui Aloha. And again, thank you very much. And I'm Lynette Cruz, speaking on behalf of Ho'oulu Lahui Aloha. And mahalo again to Office of Foreign Affairs, and thank you all for coming.
Mahalo.
Mahalo. Mahalo nui.